As many of you may know, in 1947, relations between the British governing authority and the Jews living in Israel were not good. And the story is told that Chaim, a Moshavnik, is caught by the British and imprisoned in Akko for gun running for the Haganah, the pre-state Jewish army. Chaim is sitting in a British military prison, and his wife, Chenya, sends Chaim a letter. She writes, "Chaim, it's all very well for you to go be a hero for the Jewish people. But meanwhile, we have a farm to run, and I have a field to plow because now is the time to plant potatoes. How am I going to do it, Chaim, if you're in prison?" The next morning, Chaim sits down and writes his wife, Chenya, a letter. He says, "Chenya, don't touch the ground. There are rifles buried underneath." The letter is intercepted by the British military authorities. The next morning, the farm is overrun by British soldiers. They dig up every single inch of the ground, and they don't find one single rifle. Dejected, they return to the base. The next morning, Chaim writes his wife, Chenya, "Now go plant potatoes." Yes, the great ingenuity of the early Zionists. And thank God that creativity, that resilience, that courage continues today. The Zionist spirit is alive and well in Israel. And we Jews here in America have become accustomed to the idea that Israel can overcome any of its external enemies. But my friends, as many of you know, today the headlines are full of internal strife. Israel is now undergoing one of its most consequential crises in its history. And ironically, this crisis is completely internal. After 75 years, our beloved state of Israel may have reached the point of needing to define its own version of democracy. To explain, I want to quote Yitzhak Solokov, an Israeli political analyst. He reminds us there's actually no Israeli constitution. Instead, in Israel, there are a series of what are defined as basic laws. And basic laws for many years were thought to be a substitute for a unified constitution. And given the lack of a constitution and the very deep divisions within Israeli society, neither side of the political spectrum has placed the concept of checks and balances at the top of its agenda. In 1992, the Knesset did pass a basic law known as the Law of Human Dignity and Freedom, which included what we Americans know well, the right of liberty, dignity, freedom, property, and movement from and to Israel. Then, in response, in a very unprecedented way, Chief Justice Aaron Barak, his Supreme Court at the time, used provisions of this basic law to retroactively annul laws passed by the Knesset that were seen to conflict with any of those provisions. In other words, for the first time, Israel had the right of judicial review, just 30-some-odd years ago. But that Supreme Court, in addition, began to apply what legal jurists call the concept of reasonability as grounds for annulling any legislation that the Knesset may pass. All this was possible because of the lack of a formal constitution and the very high public standing of the Supreme Court in Israel. But since the early 90s, the judicial revolution, which it was termed in Israel, may have ridden roughshod over the prerogatives and the goals of the Knesset, the Israeli legislative body. But my friends, the current response by the ruling right-wing coalition threatens to institutionalize a tyranny of the elected majority, and in the name of that majority to abandon any pretense of achieving national consensus on the definition of democracy, human rights, and the rules of the game of the political spectrum. The new Minister of Justice, Yair Levin, and the chairman of the Knesset's Constitutional Committee, Simcha Rothman, are attempting right now to pass legislation that will not only overturn the judicial revolution, but will clarify the relationship between the legislature and the judiciary in a way that will make it possible for the Knesset to appoint ministers with virtually no limitations on their power. In addition, although the proposals envision a formal recognition of the authority of the Supreme Court to annul legislation, they also envision an override provision, unprecedented, that will allow just a simple majority of 61 Knesset members, 61 out of the 120, to override the authority of the Supreme Court regarding any legislation. And as you can imagine, the proposed changes have caused massive uproar in Israel, unprecedented protest. Tonight, in just a few hours here in Israel, for the 8th Saturday night in a row, hundreds of thousands of Israelis, both on the left and the right, will be protesting in the streets. In many ways, the coalition's package goes beyond ensuring that the coalition just chooses judges. It near completely neuters the Israeli Supreme Court in the Supreme Court's capacity to strike down laws and government decisions, no matter how outrageous, and enables the majority coalition, whoever's in power, to generally re-legislate with a simple Knesset majority laws that are struck down by the Supreme Court. No democracy in the world would have such a system if the ruling majority goes through with all its plans. All this in a country that we love, but a country with no other brakes on abuse by the political leadership. No constitution, no Bill of Rights, no second parliamentary chamber, and a Knesset with zero capacity to resist any legislation advanced by a majority coalition. The practical consequence? Almost all basic rights of Israelis will be subject to the whims of the political majority of the day, with the High Court now prevented from acting. Can a national consensus still be reached in Israel? One that can bridge some of the gaps between different parts of Israeli society and give Israel the strength and the unity for the many challenges that will certainly continue to come her way. A majority of just 61 votes of the Knesset is not sufficient to override a decision of the Supreme Court, because the essence of democracy is both majority rule and protection of minority rights. That's something you and I as Americans have always treasured and loved and worked to make sure is always the case here. Such a dramatic change to the Israeli system of government would not only have far-reaching consequences in Israel, but for those of us who love Israel, for Jews here in North America, it will also affect us and our ability to defend Israel as a like-minded democracy that shares values with the United States. That internal strife that we're now seeing in Israel will reach, and has already reached in many ways, our U.S. Jewish community. Yes, in many ways, a consensus seems to be building to put the brakes, to ask Israel and the ruling majority coalition in Israel to put the brakes on. Yes, there are those on the right and the left who agree that the Israeli system of democracy needs an update. But has the right-wing coalition gone too far? Many people here in America agree that they have. And political operatives, American Jewish leaders, organizations on both sides of the spectrum have spoken out, asked to put the brakes on. This morning, I want to outline some responses and some, I believe, not good responses to what you and I can do to perhaps help the situation in Israel. One, there are some American synagogues who have decided to stop reciting the prayer for the state of Israel. Now, that prayer for the state of Israel is simply an 80-word plea for God to guide the nation's leaders and advisors, to strengthen the hands of those who defend our Holy Land, and to bless Israel with peace and its inhabitants with lasting joy. This legendary prayer was written back in 1948 by Yitzhak Herzog, Israel's first chief rabbi. And the prayer, of course, is usually recited following the Torah reading during Shabbat services. despite its hopeful message, it's become a non-starter for those opposed to Israel's new Netanyahu-led government. Some clergy, both in America and even in Israel, are actually boycotting this prayer. As Jeremy Kalmanevsky of New York's Anshe Chesed Synagogue told the Jewish newspaper, The Forward, he wrote, "I just could not imagine us saying this prayer that their efforts be successful. I think their efforts are wrong." Yes, my friends, I too have issues with the current government. As I outlined earlier, I don't feel the changes members of the current coalition want to implement will help unify the country. But not praying for them, I don't believe that's the answer. Prayers for the government have been around for centuries, going back to the Spanish Jewish community of the 14th century, praying that officials have the counsel necessary to make wise, compassionate decisions in line with the values of our tradition. When I pray for the Israeli government to thrive, I'm not favoring one agenda over another, but that Israel's leaders make decisions aligned with the values of Torah, inspired by God. If we only use the prayer for Israel when I, the senior rabbi, agreed with the current government, I'd be imposing my political agenda on all of you. I think that's wrong. And we at Beth Yeshurun will continue to recite the prayer for the state of Israel. So what are some positive steps we can take if we want, if we agree that the situation in Israel is not good? What are some things we can actually do that are constructive? I want to conclude my words by sharing a three-part approach outlined by Israeli author David Bernstein. Number one, can we adopt a they are us mindset? Because American Jews who criticize Israel often come across like they're speaking about some unknown alien nation, not their beloved state of the Jewish people. They should, I believe, those who want to criticize Israel in public should temper their criticism just as thoughtful people do when someone they love, such as a family member, disappoints them. American Jews should think of Israel's problems as our own, like trouble in our own big Jewish family. And when we criticize Israel, is it done out of hate or is it done out of love? Is it done out of bitterness or is it done out of constructive criticism? To put it in personal terms, how would you treat someone you love? What would actually be constructive? And when people you love criticize you, what actually helps? Number two, can we curb the heated moral rhetoric? Now I don't believe is the time for more open letters, emitting prayers, petitions denouncing certain leaders in Israel. Yes, I think many of us would regard Ben-Gvir, the most radical member of the current Israeli government, as someone we disagree with. No one is saying that liberal American synagogues should invite Ben-Gvir to speak at their congregation. He probably wouldn't come anyway. But to criticize him openly and publicly, does that really help? It's not even always the best way to counter domestic hatred towards Israel. And it does nothing to deplatform duly elected Israeli officials, no matter how loathsome they may be. Restraining our moral impulses will not normalize these extreme voices. They've already been normalized, unfortunately, by the thousands of people who voted them into power. Moreover, constantly expressing our disgust can be heard by ordinary Israelis, the people who actually vote and put their lives on the line by living there, as a lack of support for the state in trying times. And it will do nothing to curb the appeal of the radicals in the eyes of voters, and may even do the opposite. When rabbis and other American Jewish leaders blatantly denounce political developments in Israel, they risk alienating from the Jewish state many American Jews who may never have visited the country. In the coming months, forces in the Israeli government will likely make some highly objectionable political and policy moves, such as advancing the proposal to override the Israeli Supreme Court. I believe Jewish leaders and rabbis, all of us, should reserve our moral thunder for responding to specific policies or actions. Let us not blatantly criticize the state. Let us be more nuanced in our criticism, and let's do it out of love. And finally, and most importantly, I believe we American Jews and congregations such as Beth Yeshurun should engage with moderates in Israel. What the recent protests in Israel have shown is there are moderate Israelis on both sides of the spectrum, on the center left and the center right, who are trying to build a sustainable political and civil society in Israel. I believe American Jews should spend less time condemning the extremists and more time supporting the moderates in the middle. They need our partnership and our support more than ever. Can we bring these moderates to speak at our synagogues and with our organizations? Can we make common cause when possible? And can we lead the political trench warfare to moderate Israelis on the ground with our support here in America? Can we go to Israel? And can we give our money to those Israeli organizations that align with our values? They need our support more than ever before. But let us not condemn all of Israel for the actions of some. In conclusion, I want to remind us of an idea one of my favorite Israeli authors, Yossi Klein Halevi, recently presented at a lecture I had the pleasure of attending in Jerusalem this past summer. He reminds us that we American Jews, since the 1950s, have put on almost all of our pulpits the American flag and the Israeli flag. This was unprecedented in Jewish history. For centuries, Jews never put the flags of the country they lived in, and unfortunately, for thousands of years, there was no Jewish country. But we American Jews put these flags on our pulpits because these are the countries that saved the Jewish people. These are the countries after the destruction of the Shoah that were there to allow a revival of the Jewish people. Thank God they were there. And today, years later, decades after the Shoah, 90% of world Jewry lives either in Israel or in America. We also put these flags on our pulpits because these two beloved countries represent not only Jewish values, but the democratic values that have allowed our people to thrive since the destruction of the Shoah during World War II. And in order for these two countries to continue to thrive and be the democracies that protect you and I every single day, more than ever, we need to do more to ensure that these democratic ideals, laws, values continue to thrive. Because God forbid, if America or Israel no longer is a democracy, you and I are more trouble than we've been in a long time. Let us continue to work for those values. And God willing, those values that have allowed us to continue to thrive will continue to be with us, our children, and our grandchildren for many years to come. Yes, these are challenging times in Israel. Can we engage thoughtfully? After all, they are us. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.